San Diego Union-Tribune is San Diego's largest and most experienced news organization, winner of 4 Pulitzer Prizes and 37 regional Emmys. We deliver the news with depth, authority, and over 150 years of local knowledge. Our journalists speak truth to power. The Union-Tribune serves everyone who cares about our community. Support our work. Subscribe today on our website, SanDiegoUnionTribune.com.
Los habitantes de San Diego logran grandes cosas todos los días. Nos preocupamos por nuestros vecinos y por nuestra comunidad. Nos adaptamos al cambio. Hacemos que nuestros líderes rindan cuentas. Vivimos en una de las ciudades más dinámicas de América, el San Diego Union-Tribune y el Union-Tribune en español. Hemos contado la historia de San Diego por más de 150 años.
We use our phones to order food, share our stories, and so much more. SDCCU made banking from your mobile device easy too. You can do so much. Get up-to-date account balances, deposit checks, and more, safely and securely, all through the convenience of your smartphone. Get all of this and more with free checking with e-statements. SDCCU, it's not big bank banking, it's better.
Hello, I'm Dr. Noelle Norton, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of San Diego.
And I'm Brian Clark, a Vasiliadis Director of USD's Humanities Center.
USD, along with the College of Arts and Sciences and the Humanities Center, is proud to be the presenting sponsor for the 2022 San Diego Union-Tribune Festival of Books on the USD campus.
Our partnership with the Festival of Books enables all of us avid readers to come together as a community, alongside renowned authors from all over the world, and to dive deeply into imaginative stories and important themes.
As a university deeply committed to the liberal arts, USD promotes a form of lifelong learning that ignites curiosity, builds critical connections across different ideas and topics by seeing them from different perspectives.
On behalf of the University of San Diego, we thank you for joining us for today's program to explore the world of books with us.
Enjoy the festival.
Hello, my name is David Fisher, and I'm delighted to be here this morning, today, with my co-author, Dan Abrams. Dan is the chief legal analyst of ABC News, but he also is the host of Dan Abrams Live on News Nation, which you can get on your local cable, as well as On Patrol, live on the Reels channel. And the Dan Abrams Show, where politics meets the law on Sirius. And I'm delighted to be having worked with Dan for a series of books. And we're here today to talk about the latest book, which the New York Times, in its recent review, called it truly one of the most important untold stories in civil rights history. It's a book called Alabama v. King. And Dan, good morning. And perhaps you want to tell us what the book is about.
Good morning, David. Well, this is fun to be able to get interviewed by you as opposed to us being interviewed by others. It is interesting as to how we got to this book, too. I'll talk about what it is. But, David and I have written 4 other books on great forgotten trials in history, all involving directly or indirectly a president of the United States. And we were deciding sort of what could be our next project. And as we were sort of researching and scouring and looking, we came upon this reference to a trial in 1956 of Martin Luther King. And every one of David and my books up to this point has been based on a transcript. We've allowed that to be the yoke of the story. And that's allowed us to tell the story around the transcript of the trial. And we see that there's a transcript of a case where Martin Luther King testified for hours in 1956. Not the cases that so many know so much about, not the tax case in 1960. And so we sort of dug in a little bit, and the more we learned about the story, the richer it became. And the more we realized that we had found an untold story that really helped launch the civil rights movement. And I think it's fair to say that we truly came to that realization after talking to Fred Gray, who was
I'm going to interrupt. When you talk about an untold story, Fred Gray is a true American hero. In fact, 2 weeks ago, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
Finally.
And when we found the fact that this man existed and no one knew who he was, you had never heard of him. So why don't you tell us?
Yeah, we couldn't believe it. No, I mean, because actually I think when we first reached out to him, David, correct me if I'm wrong, we were looking at this story, but didn't even realize that he had been King's attorney in the case. Someone else had suggested that we talk to Fred Gray because he was, so knowledgeable about, civil rights history in this area. And then we realized, wait a sec, he was the lawyer for Martin Luther King in the case that we were interested in. And so we start this conversation with Fred Gray, and David's right. I mean, you do feel like you're talking to a piece of history. I mean, you talk to Fred, and he makes references to Martin this and little details about Martin here and Martin there. And you realize he's talking about Martin Luther King. And I think that that's really what took this book for us to another level was, yes, we'd found a great story. Yes, we'd found another forgotten trial. Yes, we'd found another transcript. But this one was different. This one, we had Fred Gray, who was going to work with us on this book. And that just made it, I think, took it to a completely different level.
Well, what was surprising to me is I think we all know the history of the beginnings of the civil rights movement, starting with the Montgomery bus boycott when Rosa Parks was just too tired to get up. That's American history. And as we learned from Fred Gray, who was there and tells this story in the book, it didn't happen that way at all. Fred Gray and young Fred Gray, one of two black attorneys in Montgomery, Alabama, 25 years old at the time, one of 8 black attorneys in the entire state of Alabama at the time, befriended Rosa Parks, and they planned the boycott together. And then he defended her when she was arrested. And then he defended Dr. King and went on to defend Ralph Abernathy and John Lewis and the marchers in Selma and the Freedom Riders. And having, I've been very fortunate in my career, as has you, Dan, in that we've both been able to be with people who have accomplished great things. But I had never been in awe of anybody before I met and we all became friends with 92-year-old Fred Gray, who is still practicing law.
It really is. I feel the same way. I have to say, when I've interviewed a lot of, big name people, from presidents to senators to, major entertainers, et cetera. And there was something about being with Fred Gray, and part of this is a respect for him, and part of it is a respect and love of history, was special, being there with him, and having him be able to talk to us about this time period. And it's interesting. Without Fred Gray, I don't know that the subtitle of our book is called Martin Luther King Jr. and the Criminal Trial That Launched the Civil Rights Movement, right? I would not have been comfortable pronouncing it as the case that launched the civil rights movement, right? But when Fred Gray said to us, gentlemen, this is what he said, this is the case that launched the civil rights movement. And we said, wow, okay. So this is an even bigger case than we even realized when we first started digging on this.
Well, what surprised me is that when we first approached Fred Gray, really for the first several weeks of our conversations, he assumed we were talking about the much better known Martin Luther King income tax trial, because that's the trial that got all the attention. And then one day when we were honing in, this sort of light went on in Fred, and he said, just as you said, he said, nobody talks about this trial, but this is the trial. And he talks.
What happened was we got on a call with him. So we had a couple conversations, and we get on another call with him. And the first thing he says is, gentlemen, I would like to apologize to both of you. He said, because I have been under the misapprehension or the misunderstanding that you wanted to do the 1960 case. And he said, and I realize now, and you've been very clear, you wrote this to me, you said it to me, but I now realize that you want to do this 1956 case. And you could see him become animated, right, and excited, because he too believed that this was a story that hadn't been properly told and that he believed had launched the civil rights movement.
Well, the thing that I loved about working with him is he is listening to someone who was there the day Martin Luther King was chosen to become the leader of the movement. And to make a very long story short, Fred was with a woman named Joanne Robinson, and they were looking for someone to actually lead the boycott. And there were two Black leaders in the Montgomery community, and they sort of canceled each other out. And Joanne Robinson suggested Dr. King primarily because he was new in Montgomery and hadn't been there long enough to make any enemies. And he was not widely known, even in Montgomery was not widely known. He was the pastor of a small sort of elitist church. And Fred, and this gives me chills whenever I think about it or say it, Fred said to Joanne Robinson, why Dr. King? And she looked at him and said, because he can move people with his words. Yeah. And I thought, wow, that's, and to be able to tell this story, it was amazing to me. Do you want to talk about what the trial itself was, Dan, and what we talk about in the book?
Sure. So the boycott happens, and the local officials can't figure out how to end it. It's becoming financially crippling to the bus company. 40,000 African Americans in Montgomery are literally staying off of the buses, and they were the majority of people who rode the buses. And the buses are going broke. And they have to figure out, well, what can we do? And so they decide, well, let's use the law as a sword here to try to force these people to get back on the buses. Again, just the opposite of what has happened throughout history with regard to African Americans, where the goal was to force them out. Here, the goal was to force them back onto the buses by saying that Martin Luther King and the people who organized the boycott had violated a sort of arcane anti-boycott law that had been on the books for some 30-something years and was never quite enforced. And if you look at the statute, it just basically makes it illegal to organize this kind of boycott unless you have just cause, unless there's a good reason. And that became the heart of the case, was the prosecutors decided we're going to prosecute one person,
Let me interrupt for one quick second.
Yeah, please.
They indicted 89 people.
Yes.
Rather than have 89 trials, they decided they would have one trial that would stand as the model, and they chose Dr. King.
Good clarification, because and one of the things we talk about in the book is when these people were getting indicted, it was almost celebratory, right? The people who weren't indicted were irritated, as if they weren't major players enough to be included in this indictment of the 89 people involved in the boycott. And prosecutors decide, we're just going to prosecute one. And by the way, that was kind of agreed upon by the defense as well, meaning they didn't want to have to put the resources to defending 89 people. The prosecutors didn't want to have to prosecute 89 people in different cases. So Martin Luther King's case became the case in connection with this anti-boycott law. And that's the story that we tell in this book. It is Martin Luther King on the witness stand, but more important, I would even say, or just as important, was all of the ordinary citizens of Montgomery who we quote in the book, taking the witness stand, talking about the everyday indignities that they suffered on the buses. As a legal matter, it was to show just cause. As a practical matter, it told the country for the first time how ugly what was going on in Montgomery was, because the New York Times and all of these major national publications for the first time were coming down to really examine what was happening in Montgomery. And for the first time, Martin Luther King's name was in the national media.
Yep. The Times made him their man of the day.
Yep.
Which was, for most Americans or most people who read that was the first time anyone had ever heard of this obscure minister.
Yep.
In Montgomery, Alabama. What was fun for me from the legal point of view is Dr. King, who was a minister, sworn to tell the truth, was put in an extremely awkward position in his testimony, and how he was able to maneuver around that was to me is part of the great fun of the book.
And it became clear Martin Luther King would have been a great lawyer if he had decided to become a lawyer, because he, even at this young age, he recognized the nuance of the words, meaning that they were trying to get him to admit that he was the leader and the organizer of the boycott. And he was willing to admit that he was the spokesperson for this group of aggrieved African Americans. But he never wanted to quite say, yes, I was the person who was leading the boycott. I'm going
to stop you for 1 second, because what was, again, fun to me is what was key was not to call it a boycott.
Right.
Even though it became known as a boycott, in Montgomery, among the Black community, it was a protest, which was entirely legal. And one of the problems that Dan and I really worked with throughout the entire book was when we referred to it as a protest and when we referred to it as a boycott.
Do you remember the other day, David, recently, I don't know if we were doing an interview with Fred or we were at dinner with Fred, but he referred to it as a boycott, and then he smiled and he said something about the boycott. He smiled. He goes, well, the boycott, the protest. I mean, it was so clear it was a boycott, right? But as a legal matter, they didn't want to quite acknowledge that. And that's where King had to kind of weave his words carefully in terms of what he admitted, what he said, what he didn't say. And you know, really interesting detail that sort of came out in the context of this is that he wasn't even there when they voted him to become the leader, spokesperson for the movement. And as we describe in the book, you know, it's not something that he wanted per se. So, you know, it is interesting when they try and portray him, the prosecution, as sort of this eager leader of this movement, and King can there honestly say or demonstrate a level of reluctance.
I think it's important to add what you started to talk about was the injustice and the indignity that the Black community suffered on public transportation. The law that Alabama was following was the 1896 decision Plessy v. Ferguson. And even though 80% of the riders on the Montgomery bus system were Black, they were forced to suffer incredible indignities, so much so we begin the book with a rider putting his dime in the fare box, being told to get off the bus, go to the back of the bus, the back entrance, and get back on, got in a fight with the driver who would not give him back his dime. The driver called a police officer. They got into a fight, and the police officer killed this veteran, 20-year-old military veteran, his first day after getting out of the Army. And I'm just wondering, Dan, if you might sum up what the law was in terms of how Blacks were permitted to use public transportation.
Well, I'm going to answer that, but I want to first say that I think that what I heard from the people who were riding those buses in these transcripts was they were much more offended by the everyday indignities than they were by the law. They were more offended by the way they were talked to and treated and made to, as you point out, walk off the bus and then walk back on after paying it to the back. The law basically allocated a certain number of seats in the back for Blacks, in the front for whites, and then, a sort of first come, first serve in the middle. And that became a subject for debate as to exactly what were the rules with regard to this middle group of seats, which is, by the way, where Rosa Parks had been sitting and where others, when the conflicts occurred, had been sitting. But it was, Fred will tell you, and it is clear, I think, from the book, that if the city of Montgomery had just made an effort to stop having the drivers treat people so badly, people of color, that they might not have pushed to fundamentally change the seating arrangement. I think that the seating arrangement, while obviously in retrospect is absurd, but at the time it was less offensive than were the everyday indignities that they were suffering riding the buses.
I think it's worth mentioning that under the law in Alabama, bus drivers were permitted to be armed. And in fact, were allowed to make pretty much whatever rules they wanted. And sometimes that meant skipping Black stops, forcing people to walk further than they might otherwise have been had to go to get the bus. Because Fred is such a principal, Fred is the co-author of this book with Dan and myself. At the same time this trial was going on, Fred started a parallel legal maneuver. Now you got to remember, this was a 25-year-old kid who had been practicing law for a year. And he realized that if he was going to change the world, he could not do it through a Montgomery law.
Yeah.
So
I think that in Fred's mind, there was first and foremost the federal courts, and secondly, any potential appeals that they could have in this case, meaning they knew what the outcome of this trial was going to be. There was never any thinking that somehow this judge was going to find Martin Luther King not guilty. And so the goal was, at the same time, to challenge in federal court the constitutionality of the Alabama laws. And what's so interesting is the calculus that they had to go through to determine whether and when to file a lawsuit. They knew that it was unjust. They knew that they had a good, decent, solid, strong, whatever you want to call it, legal argument. But there were potential ramifications of filing a lawsuit that made Fred and others uncomfortable. They wanted to make sure that they did it at the right time. And in fact, the precipitating event that led them to file this federal lawsuit to challenge the Alabama law was Dr. King's home being bombed. It gave them the moral ground to say, this is the time. This is the right time where we can handle any backlash to filing a federal lawsuit. And we actually start the book at that point because it was a seminal event, was the bombing of Martin Luther King's home in January of 1956.
As you said, there never was a doubt that Dr. King would be found guilty or Rosa Parks would be found guilty. But in one of the beautiful accidents of history, timely accidents of history, Dr. King's appeal was being heard before he was going to go to jail for this. This was potentially 5 years in jail and a significant fine. So this was not just a slap on the wrist. This was the White Citizens Council of Montgomery putting down the Black community and reminding them who was in power. And after Dr. King was found guilty, there was an appeal. And while the appeal was going on, the verdict came down in the federal case.
And remember that what had actually also happened was that prosecutors were more effectively using other statutes to go after the Montgomery community, to force them to ride the buses in a way where they actually thought that they were going to lose and be forced financially based on the fines that they would get to stop the boycott. And then lo and behold, as they're sort of becoming despondent about where they are as a legal matter in the state court, this federal ruling comes down at the last minute. It's almost like a made for, movie moment where they're sitting in the courtroom and they're all despondent and they're about to lose. And the reporter runs in with the ruling from the big case. But that's actually what happened here.
And that was the case that essentially overturned Plessy v. Ferguson.
Right. It took a while. It took a while for it to officially, but yes, it was. And that was very interesting. I thought, David, one of the areas of the book was the unwillingness of the institutionalists in Alabama to accept where the court was going. Right. There were all sorts of efforts to claim that, well, the opinion isn't really saying that it's unconstitutional. It's just, and it took a while to sort of enforce what the rulings were coming from the federal courts.
We were able, even though, as you say, the spine of the book is the transcript, we were able, which I loved, we were able to tell so many poignant stories. But the story that, when I heard it, it sounds whatever it sounds like, but it literally brought tears to my eyes, is when the boycott was planned. There had never been a successful economic boycott because the Black community could not, it was 40,000 people. And the concept of boycotting the buses, which was the lifeline to jobs, to social events, to everything, was unbelievable. And they called for a boycott, and they literally called for it over a weekend. And nobody knew if it was going to be successful, if anybody was going to pay attention to it or not. And there's a story we tell in the book about a group of people in a barbershop across the street from a bus stop. And on Monday morning, at the bus stop, there was one well-dressed black man waiting for the bus. And they were all curious to see what would happen. And the bus pulled up between the observers and that man, and they all went to the window to watch. And they stood there silently. And a few seconds later, the bus pulled away, and he was still standing there. Yeah. And that was when this group of people knew the boycott was going to work, and how they organized 40,000 people for a year to move around the city. And Fred was the lawyer who ran the whole thing, 25 years old.
Do you remember how the local media aided in preventing people from riding the buses, right? I mean, the local media reported that there were these sort of goons out there who were sort of enforcing the boycott. So anyone who was black could potentially get, beaten up, which was made up if they were to ride the buses. But it helped in the early days to prevent people from riding the buses. This made up story that they used to try to impugn the boycott actually had the opposite effect of leading people who hadn't heard about it, which weren't many, but if they hadn't, from saying, oh, well, maybe I shouldn't ride the buses. And as you point out, it was strikingly effective. It is hard to overstate how effective it was. And that required a whole team of volunteers who either had cars or in one case had a funeral home, which had a lot of hearses and other vehicles that were available to be used to drive people around. And they had stops where people would go and they would get free rides. And there were donations made to the MIA to allow them to fund the gas and the cars. And by the way, that became an issue in the trial, right? To prove that this boycott had been organized, there were lots of questions during the trial about who paid for the gas, who wrote the check, who was responsible for it, et cetera. And, on the one hand, the goal was to show that this was an organized boycott, but the practical, you walk away from it saying, wow, they were amazing in how effective they were at this.
As you mentioned previously, reading the testimony of these people, many of whom this was the first time in their life that they could look a white person in the face and say anything they wanted to say without any fear. And watching some of these, many of them uneducated people, dueling with these very clever white prosecutors, some of the testimony is laugh out loud funny. As you just said, there's an exchange with a prosecutor who's trying to nail down who paid for the gas. And he asked this man who owned a gas station, who bought the gas? Well, who bought the gas? The people who were driving the cars. And what did they do with the gas? They put it in the cars. Why did they put them in the cars? Because cars need gas. I mean, the way they avoided answering questions, and as Fred said, while they spoke to these people before they testified, they didn't give anybody any training or any advice. They just said, tell the truth. And the word spread in the community. and I think 48 people testified. And when you read the testimony, you feel the injustice and you feel the pride that people took in their testimony. We have been very fortunate. The first book we did together was the story of Abraham Lincoln's last criminal murder trial. He was the defense attorney in 29 murder trials. And as you said, we've done John Adams defending the British soldiers, Teddy Roosevelt in one of the great libel cases that is forgotten in history. But this, to me, anybody who is interested in the civil rights movement and how we got where we are today, this is a piece of history that is essential. That without it, I mean, I was shocked how little I knew about what really happened, because I thought I was relatively cognizant of how the movement developed.
And David, it reminds me, on each of our books, right, we've talked about the notion of a trial forgotten to history. And the Jack Ruby case, fascinating case, largely forgotten. As you point out, the Teddy Roosevelt libel case, where he takes the witness stand in his own defense for 8 days. Front page stories everywhere at the time. Somehow no one knew about it. But I have to say, on this one, it's kind of astonishing that it's been so forgotten, because you could argue on the Teddy Roosevelt case, right, that it's not an important trial, meaning it was so interesting. And it was fascinating to see Teddy Roosevelt taking the witness stand, but it didn't fundamentally change history, right? There was nothing about it that led to, you could argue there was some areas of libel law, but the bottom line is, and similar with the Jack Ruby case, it was a murder case. But this case changed history. This case was a critical piece, and it wasn't just the Montgomery bus boycott. It was the prosecution of Martin Luther King that brought the national media down to Montgomery to watch what was happening, to make the rest of the country aware of what had happened. And so, to some degree, I am more surprised that this case has been forgotten than maybe almost any other one we covered. I mean, the John Adams British soldiers case, we never claimed that was forgotten. It was just that the transcript had been forgotten. And that was the element of it that we really tried to bring to life in that book, was the transcript. But in terms of the historical impact of a forgotten case, I think that this one is far more significant than any of the other stories we've told.
Well, Dan and I would like to thank the San Diego Union-Tribune Festival of Books for having us on this morning. And you can purchase the books from local San Diego partners with the festival at bookshop.org/shop/SDFOB. The book is Alabama v. King. And if you're interested in American history and how we got where we are today, this is something you should have on your bookshelf. And we thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Great to see you.
Hi, I'm Jose Cruz, CEO for the San Diego Council on Literacy, a proud partner with the San Diego Union-Tribune in the 2022 presentation of the Festival of Books taking place this Saturday at USD. Today, we're at the festival site, and in just a few days, this campus will be buzzing with people who love books, love reading, and love writing. The Festival of Books is our community's largest single gathering place for writers, publishers, and book lovers of all ages. The San Diego Council on Literacy is the beneficiary of proceeds from this event. When you participate in the festival, you support greater literacy in our region. This means a lot of things, including more books for children who need them the most. And of course, by being here, you'll have a good time. So please join us Saturday, August 20th, as we converge with thousands of other festival attendees to celebrate the joy of reading here on the USD campus.